The sky over Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19, 1945, was a pale strip between billowing columns of smoke and ash. The sea behind the Marines boiled with landing craft and spray. Ahead, the black volcanic beach rose like an unnatural hill of crushed glass. Men in khaki and green huddled low as they advanced, boots slipping and sinking in sand that felt like iron filings. The soundscape was a layered roar of engines, exploding shells, and the hissing of suppressed anger from enemy positions dug deep into the ash and rock. To the right, a man in a shallow crater lifted a weapon that did not belong. Its shape was long and lean, like something from an aircraft ripped from its mouth. He was 23 years old. His name was Tony Stein. He wore a dusty helmet pushed back on his head, and his eyes were fixed with a mixture of fear and calculation. Around him, Marines lay flat under grazing fire. Some did not move at all. Some shouted over the noise, pointing to invisible gun positions that traced death across the beach with intersecting streams. A platoon leader tried to get his men to crawl forward, but the bullets stitched lines in the sand inches away. The standard machine guns remained on landing craft or sunk into the ash as their crews tried to set up tripods and feed belts through muddy channels. Stein's hands tightened around the improvised weapon. It had started as an aircraft machine gun, the kind mounted on bombers. He had cut and filed and drilled until it could be fired from a prone position or the hip. The men around him had laughed at first, calling it his plain gun. Now their lives hung on whether he could make it work. He knew that if it jammed, if the heavy aircraft barrel melted or the belt feed failed, his company would stay pinned until Japanese mortar crews found them. But if he could pour fire through that slit in the cliff ahead, he might open a path up the beach and through the maze of defensive works. He drew a deep breath and pushed himself into a low crouch. The Stinger weighed less than a standard heavy machine gun, but it was still almost 20 pounds of steel and wood. He squeezed the improvised trigger. A seam of flame erupted from the muzzle. The recoil hammered his shoulder like repeated sledge blows, each round leaving at 4,500 feet per second. Each second, 20 bullets left the barrel. The beach and his world narrowed to the flickering light at the end of the barrel and the faint glints in the shadows that betrayed firing ports. Dust and chips of stone flew as the rounds smashed into sandbags and concrete. A shout rose from his left as Marines recognized that a hidden bunker ahead had gone silent. The scent of cordite mixed with the sulfuric stink of volcanic earth. Tony shifted his aim. Walking bursts across a wider arc, spent casings flew, tinkling on the ash. He could not hear the clink, but he could feel the pile building near his knee. In less than 10 seconds, the belt was empty. He jerked the charging handle to clear a jam that wasn't there. His assistant gunner, a private from Ohio, fed another belt from a canvas bag. The second belt left as fast as the first. Another firing port went dark. Behind him, he sensed movement. Men who had been face down now rose to knee and then to full height, dashing forward, keeping low, moving from crater to crater. Officers shouted, the words lost, but the intention obvious. Stein lifted the gun and scuttled forward a few yards. Then he stopped and fired again. The Stinger's barrel glowed faintly. It would not last long under this pace. In Dayton, Ohio, long before the war, Tony Stein had learned to read metal as if it were wood. Born in 1921 to Austrian Jewish immigrants, he grew up in a neighborhood of factories and foundries. His parents made ends meet, and he spent his youth surrounded by the smell of oil and steel. He had an early gift with machines. At 16, he became an apprentice tool and die maker. The job required precise thinking, steady hands, and the ability to solve problems with the tools at hand. He learned to measure tolerances by feel. He could file a surface until it shone and fit perfectly with another piece. Before the war, he also spent time at Patterson Field, where the Army Air Corps tested aircraft and employed civilians in maintenance and manufacturing. He worked alongside machinists who adapted parts, welded, and improvised repairs. The knowledge of how components fit and what they could endure would later save lives on a volcanic island thousands of miles from his Ohio hometown. When the war reached across the ocean and the Marine Corps called for volunteers, Tony Stein enlisted. He became one of the Para Marines, elite infantry trained for parachute drops in jungle and island terrain. The training was rigorous. He learned to pack a parachute, to dive from a plane at 800 feet, to hit the ground with his rifle ready, and to fight in dense jungle. He experienced combat on Bougainville, a humid island in the Solomon Chain. There he saw how Japanese defensive tactics used natural terrain, caves, and networked pillboxes. He carried an M1 carbine and sometimes a Browning M1919 machine gun, which required a tripod, a belt box, and at least 2 men to operate. The Browning could put out around 500 rounds per minute, but the gun weighed 31 pounds and the tripod another 15. Moving it under fire was slow. At Bougainville, Tony sometimes saw men cut down while they tried to set up the weapon. He also saw the limitations of standard weapons when confronting well-hidden positions. He survived the campaign, and after the PAR Marine units were disbanded, he was reassigned to the 5th Marine Division preparing for the invasion of Japanese-held islands closer to the homeland. In the summer of 1944, during a training exercise, he and a fellow Marine named Mel Grevich discovered a crashed aircraft on a training field. Among the wreckage was an M2 aircraft machine gun. Designed for the PBY Catalina and other planes, the M2 was a .30 caliber Browning derivative optimized for weight and rate of fire. It used an electric solenoid instead of a conventional trigger. It fired at 1,000 to 1,200 rounds per minute, double the rate of the ground version. It lacked sights suitable for ground use and had no stock or bipod. It also did not have a cooling jacket. In the air, passing wind cooled the barrel. On the ground, repeated fire risked melting the barrel liner. Where many would have left it, Tony saw a possible solution to the problem of moving a gun forward quickly. He and Grevich asked permission from an armorer to experiment. Permission was grudgingly given. They salvaged the gun and brought it to the division's machine shop. At night, after training and cleaning weapons, the 2 men worked on the aircraft gun. Tony measured, sketched, and planned modifications. He cut down a wooden stock from an M1 Garand to fit the rear of the weapon. He fashioned a trigger mechanism that would allow a Marine to pull a lever rather than rely on an aircraft's electrical connection. He added a bipod from a Browning automatic rifle for prone firing. He attached a simple iron sight. The result looked ungainly. It had the slim barrel and receiver of the aircraft weapon combined with a shorter stock and a welded grip. They christened it Stinger because of its long, thin barrel and rapid sting. The gun weighed about 20 pounds, including a 200-round belt box slung under the receiver. Its cyclic rate remained high. The aircraft barrel would glow red after prolonged fire. Tony tested it at the range. At 100 yards, the Stinger tore large holes in targets with bursts that lasted 2 seconds. Marines who watched the test either shook their heads or grinned. Officers raised eyebrows and questioned whether such improvisation was safe. The weapon lacked official approval and would not be on standard issue. Tony shrugged. He built more, refining the design. By the time the division embarked for the invasion of Iwo Jima, 6 Stingers were hidden within footlockers, destined for what he hoped would be their proving ground. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Its value was strategic. Capturing it would deprive Japan of an early warning radar station and provide airfields for American B-29 bombers and a base for fighter escorts. Japanese commanders understood that losing it would open the skies above their homeland. They prepared with the meticulousness of engineers and the fatalism of men expecting to die. They dug 11 miles of tunnels and bunkers. They hollowed out hills and connected pillboxes with underground passages. They placed heavy machine guns and artillery in concrete casemates with multiple firing ports. They camouflaged everything with volcanic ash and vegetation. They relied on the dark sand to slow American vehicles and on overlapping fields of fire to keep Marines on the beach. They had 21,000 defenders, including elite special naval landing forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi. Kurabayashi forbade banzai charges. He ordered his men to stay hidden until the Marines were committed on the beach, then to open fire with everything. His plan was to inflict maximum casualties and delay. On February 19, 1945, the plan unfolded. The naval bombardment lasted only 3 days. Much of the Japanese defenses survived. When the first waves of Marines landed at 0900 hours, they initially met little resistance. They stepped onto the black sand and found that their boots sank 6 inches. Tanks and trucks lost traction. Then the mountain on the southern tip, Mount Suribachi, and the cliffs to the north erupted. Machine guns spat tracers that seemed to come from nowhere. Mortars and rockets exploded in the midst of men wading through knee-deep sand. Officers shouted to get off the beach, but moving was like crawling up a dune on ball bearings under a rain of steel. Tony Stein's unit, Company A of the 28th Marines, landed in the first wave. The plan was to advance inland and cut the island in half near the base of Suribachi. The reality was chaos. Men fell by the dozen within yards of the waterline. The weight of their packs and the suction of the sand slowed them. Tony and the other Stinger gunners crouched low, trying to identify the origin of the deadly streams. Standard Browning machine guns came ashore with them, but their crews could not set up quickly. Tony looked at the line of craters and dunes ahead and realized that someone needed to suppress the invisible enemy. He crawled forward until he reached a slight depression. He heard bullets whipping overhead. To his left, a man staggered and fell. His assistant gunner, who carried spare belts, lay belly down, face white. Tony knew that the Stinger's high rate of fire could cut through the interlocking arcs, but only if he could see his targets. He remembered training. A muzzle flash is visible for a split second. He made a choice. He rose to a kneeling position, making himself a clear silhouette against the sand and sky. Enemy gunners saw him and fired. Bullets snapped past his helmet. One struck the top and skipped off, leaving a dent. He held his stance long enough to catch the origin of the flashes. Then he dropped to prone, swung the Stinger, and pulled the trigger. The weapon bucked. Within 2 seconds, he walked a stream of rounds into the firing port he had seen. The firing from that port ceased. He swept to the next, repeating the sequence. The noise around him seemed to reduce. Marines to his left shouted and scrambled forward. A lieutenant pointed to the crater where Tony lay and yelled for machine gun support. Tony shifted and fired again. Each belt of 100 rounds lasted roughly 6 seconds at the aircraft gun's rate. After each, he reached back to his assistant, who hooked another belt to the feed. Smoke from the muzzle drifted around his face, acrid and stinging his eyes. The barrel became so hot that a slight shimmering heat haze appeared around it. He knew it would droop if he kept firing long bursts. He kept his bursts short. He directed them at suspicious shadows and rocky outcroppings. He saw dust and chips fly. Sometimes he saw figures slump. He did not have time to count. The Marines around him advanced. The critical moment when the entire attack could have stalled past because a handful of Stingers and their operators brought more bullets to bear than the defenders expected. Within minutes, Tony's belt supply dwindled. Each Stinger belt weighed several pounds. The assistant gunner's bag was nearly empty. In training, they had practiced belt changes. In combat, the pace was faster. Each belt fired felt like a gulp of water thrown on a raging fire. Tony looked back towards the landing craft. Piles of ammunition boxes lay in the sand, dropped by Marines who had been killed or wounded before they could move them forward. He also saw men lying wounded, some screaming, some silent. He slung the Stinger across his chest, grabbed his empty bag, and shouted to his assistant to stay. Then he ran. His first run back to the beach was a test of the sand more than the bullets. His boots sank and slowed him. He bent forward to maintain balance. Mortar shells landed nearby, spraying him with sand. He found a wounded Marine trying to crawl. He grabbed the man by his collar and hoisted him onto his shoulder, feeling the weight of another human with gear. He continued towards the waterline, bullets snapping at his heels. At the sand's edge, he dropped the man near a group of corpsmen. Without pausing, he filled his bag with belts and turned back. The return journey meant running uphill with added weight. He leaned into it. A machine gun opened up from an angle he had not noticed. Bullets whipped past. He threw himself into a shell hole, counted to 3, then sprinted to the next depression. He arrived back at his position winded. His assistant had reloaded 2 belts from the few left. Tony dropped to his knees and fed fresh belts. He wiped sweat mixed with grit from his eyes. His feet felt heavy. He fired again, suppressing new enemy positions that had opened up while he was gone. The pattern repeated. In total, Tony made 8 trips to the waterline that day. On each, he carried belts and often a wounded Marine. He learned that his boots filled with sand and water, adding weight and causing blisters. After his second run, he decided to remove them. He pulled off his boots and socks and left them in the crater. The volcanic sand was rough, like sandpaper on his soles, but he felt lighter. He also removed his helmet. The extra half-pound mattered when sprinting under fire. Other Marines shouted at him, thinking him crazy for discarding protection, but he knew that speed increased his chances of survival. By his third trip, the nickname Barefoot Corporal stuck. He accepted it without comment. His mind focused on the mathematics of time and distance. He calculated that each trip took roughly 3 minutes. 1 minute out, 30 seconds to collect ammunition and a man. 1 minute back, 30 seconds to pass belts and reposition. Each minute that he wasn't firing was a minute when enemy guns could resight. He also knew that the Stinger's barrel would eventually warp if he fired too many continuous belts. He rotated barrels when he could, but there were only a few spares. Between runs, he fought micro-battles. At one point, the stinger jammed because sand clogged the feed. He cursed, flipped the gun over, wrapped it sharply, and pulled back the charging handle. The belt resumed. At another, the bipod leg snapped when he knocked it against a rock. He improvised by resting the gun on his forearm and firing from the hip, using short bursts. He learned to lay the gun on the sand and kneel behind it, using the mound as a rest. Each solution came because he had built the weapon and knew its parts intimately. When a bullet struck the wooden stock, splintering a section, he shrugged and kept firing. The weapon kept spitting death at a rate that the Japanese had not anticipated from infantrymen. One of his runs turned into a deadly duel. As he dashed towards the beach, a single rifle shot cracked and thudded into sand near his foot. He felt the vibration. Another shot followed, clipping the edge of his ammunition bag. He realized someone was tracking him with a scoped rifle. He did not slow. He mentally traced a line back based on the angle of the bullet strikes. The shots were coming from a slight rise behind a collapsed bunker. On his return with belts and a wounded Marine, the shots resumed. He reached his crater, dropped the Marine, and lay flat. He peered through a gap in the sand and saw a faint glint at the top of a mound. He decided not to wait for the sniper to fire again. He shifted the stinger, braced it against the sand, and fired a short burst at the mound. Chips of rock flew. He fired another burst slightly higher. The glint disappeared. Later, another Marine who crawled forward reported a dead Japanese sniper with a shattered rifle. Tony nodded, but did not celebrate. It was one man among many. He had to keep moving. The stinger proved particularly valuable when Company A confronted larger defensive works. The Japanese had constructed a series of interlocked pillboxes made of concrete and volcanic rock, shaped like wedges with slit openings. Normal infantry rifles could not penetrate the walls. Flamethrower teams and demolition units had to get close to neutralize them. On D-Day +1, Tony's company faced a crescent-shaped line of such positions overlooking a slight rise. Mortar shells and grenades rained down. Tanks tried to approach, but became stuck in the sand or were targeted by anti-tank guns. The company commander ordered a flanking maneuver. Tony and another stinger gunner were told to suppress the bunkers so that engineers could get close with satchel charges. Tony crawled within 40 yards of the first pillbox. He could see the narrow firing slit. A machine gun inside spat in short, controlled bursts. Tony aimed slightly above the slit and fired. The stream of rounds created a small hole in the wall after a few seconds. He adjusted downward, raking the opening. Then he shifted to the next slit, repeating the process. He kept alternating to prevent the defenders from returning fire effectively. Meanwhile, engineers crawled forward with 30-pound satchel charges. At 20 yards, the engineers stood up and ran the final distance, slamming their charges into the openings. Tony and the other stinger gunner switched to covering fire. The satchel charges exploded, blowing the bunkers inward. The shock wave rolled across the sand. Marines cheered and rushed forward to secure the rubble. In one assault, the stingers fired close to 1,000 rounds in under a minute, emptying belts and requiring immediate resupply. Tony's arms ached. His shoulder was bruised from the repeated impact. His right hand had a blister from the improvised trigger lever. He ignored the pain. As the battle moved off the beach, Tony's world changed. The terrain became a mix of jagged rock and steep slopes, cut by deep ravines. Hill 362A, a high point near the center of the island, loomed. It was heavily fortified. The Japanese exploited natural caves and reinforced them. The Marines had to fight for each yard. Tony continued to use the stinger, but the supply lines were stretched. He made fewer runs back to the beach as ammunition dumps were established closer. He still carried wounded men when he could. Each time he carried a comrade, he risked being shot, but he considered the risk worth it. Marines he saved later said that he moved with mechanical efficiency, rarely breaking stride. He spoke little, focusing on the task. On February 22nd, after 3 days of near-continuous fighting, Tony was hit. Artillery fragments sliced into his shoulder and thigh. He ignored the pain at first, but the wounds bled. A corpsman ordered him to stop. He argued briefly, then agreed to evacuate. He was sent to an aid station. There, doctors saw that his wounds were serious enough to require evacuation to a hospital ship. He was placed on a landing craft and taken to the USS Samaritan, a hospital ship anchored offshore. Nurses cleaned his wounds. A doctor told him he had done enough and would be shipped back to Hawaii or even to the United States. Tony lay on a clean white sheet, looking at fluorescent lights and hearing the distant thump of naval guns. He felt restless. His company was still fighting. Friend were on Hill 362A, a vital piece of high ground. News filtered in through stretcher bearers that the fight inland was brutal. He believed his weapon and his presence could still make a difference. Late at night, he slipped out of his bunk, dressed in his uniform minus boots, grabbed his dog tags, and walked quietly past sleeping patients and nurses. No one stopped him. He found a boat taking supplies to the beach. He climbed aboard. The coxswain looked at him and shook his head, then shrugged. Tony arrived back on the island before dawn. He found an M1 Garand and a bandolier of ammunition. He slung them and began the long walk back to his unit. The journey across the still contested island to Hill 362A was itself dangerous. He had to dodge pockets of Japanese soldiers still hiding in caves. He moved with caution, hugging the ground and listening for voices in a foreign tongue. He passed Marines moving in the opposite direction, wounded and exhausted. They looked at him, a man in a blood-stained uniform, barefoot, carrying a rifle. Some recognized him. They nodded. One told him the unit's current position. It was 2 miles away uphill. Tony kept going. He arrived at Company A's lines late in the day. The men were surprised to see him. His commander ordered him to the rear, but Tony insisted on joining a night patrol. On March 1st, Tony joined a small reconnaissance patrol sent to probe Japanese lines on Hill 362A. The hill had multiple terraces and ravines. Enemy snipers and machine guns made movement treacherous. The patrol's mission was to find firing positions to be targeted by artillery and to avoid engaging in a pitched battle. The team moved cautiously through scrub and rock. At one point, they took cover in a shell crater. A sudden crack echoed across the ravine. Tony flinched. A bullet struck his helmet and passed through. He felt a sting on his temple. He touched his head and felt dampness. It was a graze. He whispered to the patrol leader, indicating he was fine. They continued. They reached a slope overlooking a suspected bunker. Tony peered through binoculars. He marked a point on his map. Another shot rang out, this time from closer range. The bullet hit Tony just above his left eye, between the helmet rim and his temple. He collapsed backward without a sound. The patrol leader grabbed him, but the wound was mortal. Blood pooled in the volcanic dust. A corpsman pressed a bandage, but shook his head. The patrol radioed the coordinates of the suspected sniper nest and withdrew. An artillery forward observer called in a barrage. The hillside erupted in flame and debris. After the bombardment, Marines assaulted the position and found the sniper's hide torn apart. Hill 362 would fall days later. The Marines would raise the American flag twice on Mount Suribachi, but the fighting inland would continue for weeks. Tony Stein's body was eventually evacuated back to the United States. For his actions on the first days of the invasion, his commanding officers recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The citation read that he had personally improvised an aircraft-type weapon and carried it through the action. It noted that he made 8 trips back to the beach through intense fire to retrieve ammunition, that he rescued multiple wounded men, that he destroyed enemy positions, and that he continued to fight until he was wounded. It acknowledged that his actions enabled his company to break free from the beach and gain a foothold. President Harry S. Truman presented the medal posthumously to Tony's widow, Deanne. She stood with their infant son in front of a curtain in Washington, D.C., while a citation was read. Tony's mother wept quietly beside her. The medal, a blue ribbon with a gold star, hung heavy. It symbolized sacrifice and ingenuity. It also represented the loss of a husband, son, and father. After the war, Tony Stein's remains were reinterred in Dayton. A destroyer escort, USS Stein, was commissioned in 1972, bearing his name. It served for decades, a gray steel tribute to a young man who built a gun out of aircraft parts. Within the Marine Corps, his story became part of the informal curriculum. In training, drill instructors cited him when teaching recruits about improvisation and initiative. They recited the phrase improvise, adapt, overcome. They mentioned the barefoot corporal who ran barefoot across the black sands of Iwo Jima to fetch ammunition and rescue wounded comrades. They emphasized that sometimes doctrine must yield to practical solutions conceived by men facing immediate problems. The Stingers themselves did not survive the war. They were improvised, unregistered weapons used in one campaign. After the island was secured, most were cannibalized for parts or disposed of. For decades, their existence was a footnote. Only later did historians and weapons enthusiasts reconstruct the story of how an aircraft gun became a handheld machine gun that saved lives. The lessons of Tony Stein's story extend beyond a single weapon or a single battle. They highlight the intersection of industrial skill and combat necessity. The war mobilized a generation that had grown up in factories and farms, men who understood metal and physics, who could weld and drill. When confronted with the rigid supply chain of wartime bureaucracy and the immediate needs of the battlefield, they used their knowledge to create new tools. Sometimes higher command frowned on such innovation, fearing liability or deviation from standard. In Stein's case, the innovation was tolerated by a commander who trusted his men. It paid off. The Stinger addressed a specific tactical gap, the need for a high rate of fire weapon that could move with assault troops across broken ground. It was not a perfect weapon. It overheated quickly. It consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. It had limited range. But in the context of Iwo Jima's opening hours, its psychological and physical effect was decisive. The Japanese defenders could not believe that an individual Marine on foot could deliver firepower comparable to a bomber's turret. Some survivors later recounted being stunned by the volume and accuracy of fire from a single point. They assumed a hidden heavy machine gun with multiple crew. They did not imagine a barefoot corporal wielding a hybrid weapon he had assembled himself. In their war diaries, Japanese soldiers wrote of Americans with many guns and much courage. They expressed frustration at the inability of their own weapons to suppress such fire. That frustration may have contributed to mistakes, leading to hasty repositioning and exposure. Tony's combination of calculated bravery and mechanical ingenuity exploited those mistakes. After the war, the story of the Stinger faded in public memory, eclipsed by images of flags on Suribachi and larger strategic narratives. In the community of Marines and military historians, it endured. In the 1960s, an article in a veteran's newsletter recounted the Stinger, sparking interest among collectors. Several attempts were made to reconstruct a Stinger using surviving and /M2 parts and Browning components. Museums now sometimes display replicas, with placards explaining their origin. Visitors read about a corporal who saw a problem, solved it, and then used a solution to protect his friends. The Stinger also influenced later thinking about squad automatic weapons. After the war, the U.S. military recognized the need for a light machine gun that could provide high rates of fire while being carried by a single soldier. The result was weapons such as the M60 and later the M249. Engineers studied wartime improvisations, including the Stinger, for insights into ergonomics and operation. They incorporated quick-change barrels, lighter frames, and better sights. In this way, Tony's garage-made hybrid contributed indirectly to the evolution of infantry arms. On a personal level, Tony Stein's life and death remind us that history is composed of individual choices and actions. He did not set out to be a hero. He was a machinist who applied his trade to a battlefield problem. He did not leave behind letters filled with philosophy or grand pronouncements. He left behind the impression that one person, given tools, training, and trust, could adapt to circumstances and make a difference. In the barren sands of Iwo Jima, surrounded by death and fear, he chose to stand up, to draw fire, to observe, and to return fire with a weapon he had made. He chose to run barefoot across ground that swallowed boots to fetch ammunition and carry wounded men. He chose to leave a hospital ship because he felt his place was with his comrades. These choices cost him his life. They also saved others. As we tell his story, we honor not only him, but all who improvised and endured. Wars are often remembered by dates and maps, by decisions of generals and presidents. Yet within those broad strokes are moments when an individual's hands-on knowledge and willingness to break convention change outcomes. In the remains of a crashed plane, Tony saw not scrap, but potential. In the resistance of an officer to his idea, he saw a challenge rather than a final word. In the black sand of Iwo Jima, he saw an obstacle to overcome, not a grave. His story invites us to look at problems around us with similar creativity and resolve. We also recognize that such stories can disappear unless we record them. Memories fade. Veterans pass away. Improvised weapons are dismantled. Medals tarnish in drawers. When we share these narratives, we restore humanity to events often reduced to statistics. We remember that 20,000 Japanese defenders were not faceless adversaries, but men ordered to hold ground at all costs. We remember that the first wave of Marines on Iwo Jima were not nameless figures in photographs, but individuals like Tony Stein, with families, trades, and personalities who boarded landing craft knowing the odds. Thank you for watching this exploration of a remarkable Marine and his improvised weapon. If this story resonated with you, consider liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Each view and comment helps ensure that the memory of people like Tony Stein endures. Your support allows us to continue uncovering and telling these hidden chapters of history, making sure they are not lost to time.